is a hearing of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. The title of this hearing is Digital Authoritarianism and the Global Threat to Free Speech. We'll have one panel testifying today. It'll feature Sarah Cook, who's the Senior Research Analyst for East Asia and Director of the China Media Bulletin, Freedom House. Clive Hamilton is a Professor of Public Ethics at the Charles Sturt University in Canberra and author of Silent Invasion, China's Influence in Australia. And Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, President, Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. I want to thank all of you for being here. I understand that Professor Hamilton has a speaking engagement at the State Department immediately following this hearing, so once the testimony is concluded, commissioners will take a few minutes to ask him any questions they may have, and then we'll return to the rest of the Q&A. The topic, of course, on today's hearing is freedom of expression and China's pervasive and unrelenting efforts to stifle speech at home and now increasingly abroad, and so it's timely and it is important. We've long known the Chinese Communist Party's massive censorship regime and suppression of free speech and expression within its own borders. The Commission's political prisoner database testifies to the human toll of the Chinese Communist Party's repression in this regard. But now the party is increasingly exporting its authoritarianism abroad, trying to suppress speech, stifle free inquiry, and seek to control narratives around the world. America and other like-minded nations must contend with this long arm of China and the growing threat it poses to our open democratic systems. With the conclusion of last month's 2018 National People's Congress, the Chinese president and the Communist Party General Secretary emerged newly empowered and emboldened, no longer tethered by term limits, and overseeing a noteworthy expansion of Communist Party control over every aspect of China. These institutional developments reinforce his directives to Chinese media outlets to exhibit absolute loyalty to the party and his declaration in 2016 that all media must be surnamed party and convey positive news about China in conformity with the party's ideology. China's vast censorship regime is without parallel. Freedom House's 2017 Freedom on the Net report named China the world's worst abuser of internet freedom for the third consecutive year. And the Commission's most recent annual report noted the increased detention and criminal prosecution of citizen journalists who are a key source of information on labor protests, petitioning the government for redress of grievances, and other rights defense efforts. These detentions hinder the ability of those of us outside of China to know what is happening inside the world's most populous nation. Foreign journalists face restrictions and harassment, including physical abuse, physical and online surveillance, denying or threatening to deny reporters visas, restricting their access to certain areas of the country, harassment of sources and news assistants. Restrictions on expression are not limited to journalists. A State Department travel advisory that was issued in January of this year warned of the following, and I quote, "Security personnel have detained and or deported U.S. citizens for sending private electronic messages critical of the Chinese government," end quote. The latter point underscores China's surveillance efforts, which feature prominently in any discussion of government censorship or curbs on free expression. The Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is an incubator of sorts where authorities have pursued invasive and involuntary collection of personal data that includes DNA and fingerprints from individuals, and it's all been implemented and have all implemented the widespread use of facial recognition systems, all set against the backdrop of the detention of thousands of Muslims in political education centers. Nationwide, the Chinese government is in the process of implementing a social credit system, which, if successful, will track and compile data on every Chinese citizen and possibly even rank them based on their behavior, including their online speech. In fact, there was an open source report yesterday about an individual, the first one banned from traveling because of his quote-unquote score or profile. Made possible by the massive collection of citizens' data and a growing network of hundreds of thousands of surveillance cameras, as well as voice and facial recognition capabilities, experts anticipate the system will be used to punish those viewed insufficiently loyal to the Communist Party. Any discussion of censorship and surveillance invariably turns to technology. Foreign technology firms, many of them household names here in America, are clamoring, begging to have access to the vast Chinese market, or, for those already there, are increasingly willing to make Faustian bargains in pursuit of their bottom line. Consider, for example, Apple. In February, they transferred its cloud data in China to servers inside of China that are run by a state-owned Chinese firm, in order to comply with last year's cybersecurity law. And yet, we see its CEO at international forums basically touting the great partnership with China and thanking them for their openness while sometimes critical of our own country. And when this sort of compliance to these sorts of laws leads to complicity and rights abuses, it cannot simply be business as usual. Look beyond China. It seems that not a week goes by without some story of China's long arm threatening free and open societies, as Professor Hamilton can no doubt attest. A key element in the Chinese government's long arm efforts is focused on information technology and the internet, and internet governance or sovereignty. They assert national control of the internet and social media platforms, not only in recent domestic cyber legislation and development plans, but also at international gatherings. Additionally, there are growing examples of attempts by the Chinese government to guide, buy, or coerce political influence and control discussion of what they deem sensitive topics. China's Great Firewall, grave rights violations in ethnic minority regions, arrest of citizen journalists and rights lawyers, suppression of speech, these are the familiar markings of an authoritarian one-party state. But to the extent that the same authoritarian impulses animate the Chinese government and party's efforts abroad, including inside the United States, it directly threatens our most deeply held values and our national interests. So I look forward to today's testimony. I regret that a previously scheduled witness, Mr. Roy Jones, an American worker who was fired from his job at Marriott for inadvertently liking a tweet posted by a pro-Tibet group, is unable to join us. His story, which has now been well documented, is a painful and poignant reminder of the Chinese Communist Party's long arm, of their ability to coerce and get witting or unwittingly cooperation from American corporations and companies who are interested in protecting their market status in China, even if it means firing an American worker the way Marriott did because they liked a tweet or a post about Tibet. There are very real costs involved if we fail to confront China's pernicious authoritarianism at home and increasingly abroad, and if we fail to address it, Americans here at home and those of us who love democracy and freedom around the world, including many of our allies in Europe and Australia and the Asia-Pacific region, could find ourselves living in a world where we work somewhere or live somewhere where we cannot speak freely without losing our job or some other benefit, because who we work for or who controls us is not ourselves, but a foreign government who uses the leverage of access to its market in order to reach here and impact one of our most cherished principles. Thank you all for being here. As promised, we're going to start with Professor Hamilton. Let me just set the stage briefly, because people watch this issue, and I think it's important to understand this context so they understand why it is that we are focusing on this issue. So, 25, 30 years ago, as China began to emerge as participants in the global economy, the widespread conventional wisdom was that the more prosperous they became, the more they would behave like a democracy and be open to some of the ideas and notions of the West, and certainly of freedom and of expression and the like. But they knew that history too. They understood that as nations became more prosperous, their people demanded more political liberties, and so they have figured out a way to craft a system, given the sheer volume and size of their economy, to basically have a communist party at the center of their daily lives, a central, powerful government that, by the way, they link back to its thousands of years' history as part of their values and their success, but allowing free market activity, though not identical to ours. In essence, if you're a prosperous Chinese corporation, you may be independently owned, but when the government comes calling, you're going to do what they tell you, even if you don't want to do it, or you'll be charged with corruption, or you won't be in business for long. In that context, they view the world, they view these things like notions of freedom of expression and speech, not just as a threat. Their number one priority, above everything else, is to maintain the Communist Party in charge. They view all of these principles in the West and all these things that we're talking about as threats to that. But broader than that, they don't view it as their rules. They didn't write these rules, so why should they follow them? And they're trying to redraw the global order along the principles that they argue for. And you start to see that exercise itself. They are beginning now to link their economic influence and power to their political gains and goals. And we hear your story, Professor Hamilton, and we start thinking, boy, that's far-fetched. It sounds like a movie. We really aren't that far from that happening here in the United States, if you start to think about it. Perhaps it's already happened, just not, and we certainly know that an individual working for the Marriott Hotel was fired because he liked a tweet, which he says he did by mistake, by the way, but he was fired for that. We wish he could have testified here today. That said, a couple things I would point to, and the first is, just to be abundantly clear, you had an opportunity to publish a book and ran into impediments because publishers came to you and basically said, I know we have a contract, but we're not going to be able to go forward because, number one, they're going to get really rich billionaires acting as agents of the Chinese government to sue us and tie us up in courts here in Australia. Number two, we're worried about what it might imply to our access as a company, beyond your book, to that 1 billion plus population market that they have. So, and you've seen that play out now in academia as well, where you have university presses and even other here in the United States, where you have speeches canceled because universities have a program over there and they feel that they're going to pull the plug on that and or on the lucrative business of attracting Chinese students to travel and study here at exorbitant tuition rates. All those things are threatened. They feel those things are threatened if they publish a book or if they invite a speaker on campus. That is clearly what you've experienced and what we've seen replicated here. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, indeed, Senator, it is. I'd point out that, as I said in my testimony, the disturbing thing about the spiking of silent invasion was not because Allen and Unwin felt that its market in China would be threatened, because it doesn't have a market in China, but that the CCP would interfere in Australian domestic politics through the use of the legal system to stop Australians hearing from another Australian about a concern to a threat to our democratic values. That was the most disturbing aspect of it. And as I tried to stress in my statement to the Commission, universities are exceptionally important because intellectuals, academic scholars, they set the tone. They are the experts on whom we rely for information about China and the meaning of what's happening. And now that in Australian universities, as universities around the world, but particularly in Australian universities, because the number of Chinese students at Australian universities is proportionately 5 times higher than in the United States. And so the financial dependence is very heavy indeed. And money can buy silence. Money can buy compliance. And one thing that has disturbed me tremendously in the writing of this book, and even more so since publication, is the way in which the defenders of fundamental democratic rights, particularly the right to free speech, can be bought off. I mean, of course, they don't see it that way. They have all sorts of excuses and arguments about we have to balance the various interests of the university. Well, as I've said to those who've argued this to me, who've tried to persuade me not to criticise their university too heavily in my book, I said, well, no, it's not a question of trading off academic freedom against income from China. You know, academic freedom trumps other factors. You are not a commercial enterprise, and even if you were, we would expect you to have an attachment to basic democratic values. And yet the commercialisation of universities in Australia has been so strong, and they've become so heavily dependent not only on money from Chinese students, but from a whole network of research and other relationships with Chinese universities, that the senior executives of those institutions are always worrying about what might happen on their campuses that could jeopardise that relationship. And I think this is deeply concerning for the future of the Western university if we are going to maintain that unique institution.
Well, and again, I'm not certainly an expert on the Australian laws, but I do know we come from a common law tradition, so there's probably something similar to what I'm about to cite. And your case, as you outline it, is something that I hope we will examine in federal law here in the United States, because I think it falls within the context of something called intentional interference with a business agreement, or intentional interference with a contractual relation. The elements of it, I pulled them up here just to make sure here are the elements, and I think you fulfill every single one of them. The existence of a contractual relationship or beneficial business relationship between two parties That could be a job with a company, or in your case, a contract with a publisher. Knowledge of that relationship by a third party. Obviously, the Chinese government and/or its agents had knowledge. Intent of the third party, in this case, the Chinese government and others, to induce a party to the relationship to breach the relationship. The lack of any privilege on the part of the third party to induce such a breach. In essence, there's no privilege for them to be able to do that. It's not like they're violating a contract with them. They're simply doing it because they want to silence your voice. The contractual relationship is breach, and damage to the party against whom the breach occurs. I mean, it seems to me as if, I don't know if there's a similar statute under Australian law, but it seems to me that the case you've described fits this criteria. And it would be interesting to examine, I confess I haven't done so before this hearing today, how such a scenario, if it played out in the United States, whether it's an employee that works somewhere and is fired because of that interference, or whether it's a book deal or a speech for compensation or the like, if in fact there is evidence and someone can go to court and prove that actions on behalf of a government and/or its agents caused a breach in that sort of contract, whether there shouldn't be a cause of action and damages. And if you can't collect against the Chinese government, then collect against the party that you had the contract with and violated it out of fear. And again, I think some of the things that gets people's attention is when suddenly there's a civil cause of action for this. And this is going to require a lot more work, and I've got to think about it, but we cannot allow this to continue as far as our laws here are concerned. And I, for one, intend to look at and see whether or not there are changes to be made in federal law so that if what happened to you happens to someone here, whether it's a book deal or employment at Marriott, and then are fired by interference, yes, that person now has a cause of action, yes, to pursue against the employer or the book contractor if they can't collect against the Chinese government, and maybe both.
Well, it could be a very powerful counter-use of the legal system to resist this kind of intimidation. There have been cases in Australia where Australians of Taiwanese heritage have been fired from their jobs because when their bosses asked them if they supported Taiwanese independence, they said yes, and they were fired. This is clearly contrary to employment law in Australia. You can't fire someone for their political opinions, and yet the situation is such that no one has taken it upon themselves to defend these people. So it's clearly contrary to employment law. The difficulty in the case of my book is that one would need to be able to demonstrate in a court of law that a litigant against Allen and Unwin, who might be mentioned in the book, was acting on behalf of a foreign power for political reasons rather than out of a genuine concern for the damage to their reputation. I suspect that if the new foreign interference law is passed in Parliament, and it should be, although, I mean, it is likely to be, albeit with some amendments, then we will find that the intelligence agencies, in collaboration with the Australian Federal Police, the enforcement body that would be responsible for enforcing the laws, would be able to, the intelligence agency, ASIO, would be able to provide its secret intelligence information, establishing those links between a litigant and the Chinese Communist Party, which would be a basis under the new foreign interference laws for a prosecution. And those acts of foreign interference, which are there defined, carry very heavy penalties indeed. And so many of us are looking forward not only to the passage of the legislation, but the first prosecutions under the new laws, because we feel as though that will be a watershed in which the intelligence agencies and the law enforcement agencies come together to make an example of Beijing's proxies attempting to undermine the democratic rights of Australians, including the right to free speech by publishing a book like this.
Well, it's just my final point before I turn over to the co-chair, but and then I thank you for being here. I really want what you've said here today to be heard by the State Department. Two final points. One, it's amazing what people admit to and/or what you can find under subpoena, or what they admit to when they're under oath and facing perjury. And so again, that's why I think the legal system is created for protecting people. The other is something you mentioned, how one of the reactions now has been to cite this as xenophobic measures and the like. It's interesting. I didn't get there, but I just did an interview a few minutes ago with a major news outlet talking about Confucius Institutes. And one of the questions in there was, isn't this just scaremongering, as if to imply this is anti-communist scaremongering, and perhaps you can see how that could be extended. It's one of the arguments that some of the schools that continue to fight us on Confucius Institutes are making. It's an absurd one, since this commission every year publishes long lists of Chinese citizens who are detained, since much of the information that we get about what's happening are abuses against Chinese citizens. And then as far as scaremongering is concerned, I think if there's been a positive development on this front is that just in the last 6 to 8 months, there is a growing awareness across the whole of government about the scale and the scope of what we are up against here. And it has not yet, we're going to get to Ms. Sweat and Dr. Sweat in a moment, but it has not yet potentially translated all the way there, but we're on our way there, and we're going to make it a priority. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate it very much. Let me now turn, I guess, Dr. Sweat, I'll start with you on this one because, and I think your testimony is very compelling. I too am concerned about the lack of more progress on breaking down internet firewalls. And I did want to share with you, we received late last night a letter from the CEO and director of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, Mr. Lansing, and just to, here's what he cites, and I wanted to give you a chance to respond because you haven't, I don't know if you've even seen the letter.
I haven't.
Okay. It says, in fiscal year 2017, Congress appropriated $50.5 million to promote internet freedom globally. And then BBG receives approximately a quarter of these funds, $15 million. The law makes clear that BBG funds should be available for tools and techniques to securely develop and distribute BBG digital content, facilitate audience access to such content on websites that are censored, and coordinate the distribution of BBG digital content to targeted regional audiences, and to promote and distribute such tools and techniques, including digital security techniques. To meet our statutory mandate, our annual Appropriation Act requires that BBG's primary goal in funding these technologies is to secure safe and secure access to BBG content. And goes on to say, and a significant secondary benefit is that once users reach a BBG platform, they then have means to access the internet writ large. So I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that. The fundamental argument he's making is they only get $15 million, and it is primarily supposed to be to open up access to BBG content, not to the internet at large.
Well, it's my understanding that that provision was added into only the most recent appropriations bill. That is new language that was inserted, it is my understanding, through the intense lobbying efforts of BBG. And while I have no objection to the BBG wanting to promote access to their content, I think that it is a very flimsy excuse for not funding technologies that enable vast numbers of people to access the internet freely. I know of a number of other circumvention tool providers who would be quite happy to structure their technologies so that the first place they land is a BBG landing page, and then from there they are able to go into the wide internet. But I think, and this is the bottom line, they are spending not $15 million on firewall circumvention technologies. They are spending a small fraction of that. It's my understanding, and this is where I hope that your commission and that you as individual leaders in Congress can drill down and compel them to give you the answers, because our Internet Freedom Coalition gets, frankly, blocked and diverted and stymied and sort of pushed off when we try to drill down and get the actual answers. But it is my understanding that of that $15 million, less than $3 million is actually being given in grants to vendors who are doing the work that Congress wants to see done. They are expending it in a variety of ways, as I indicated in my testimony, for small-scale research and development, small-scale tools, VPNs, which are important but don't have the ability to resist the large-scale attacks launched by China or other repressive regimes. And at the end of the day, the numbers simply aren't there. And it is more than a little disingenuous for BBG to come back and say, well, we are required by law only to promote our content, when that is a new provision in the law inserted there by the BBG. You know, it's sort of a different version of the person who throws themselves on the mercy of the court as an orphan when they're being charged with the murder of their parents. BBG sought that provision in the latest appropriation bill. It has not been there previously. I don't have a huge objection to the notion of wanting to encourage people to access BBG content, but I am a little troubled by the idea that we use internet freedom dollars that Congress has appropriated to force them to read only the material produced by the BBG. It somehow doesn't sit right with this notion of free access. And, I think, I don't want to pick a fight with the BBG. I love much of what the BBG does. As I mentioned, my father, grew up first suffering under the, depredations of the Nazis during the Holocaust, and then experienced what it was to live under communism. Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, Radio Marti, these are valuable services. I want the BBG to continue doing that. But it is also a reality that increasingly people are seeking out information digitally on the internet. They are not restricted, and nor should they be restricted to sort of the information that we are providing through those mechanisms. So I would say, and again, some of my language I know is tough, but I feel so passionate about this because we have been so frustrated and so stymied for so long, and there is no good explanation as to why that should be the case. So be very careful when they show you numbers or when they come back with a seemingly very reasonable response. Compel them to provide the actual facts behind the matter. And I would really encourage you and your staffs talk to the developers of these circumvention technologies. Find out from them, what is the problem? What are you being told? Why are you being cut off from funding? Right now, BBG is funding one technology, to the best of my knowledge. Happens to be a commercial technology, not one developed by dissidents, not one being offered free of charge, but a commercial technology. There should be, let a thousand flowers bloom, was that Mao's phrase. If we were doing what we should be doing, if we were offering on an annual basis not $15 million, but $30 or $50 million, as Congress has indicated, of funding for this kind of technology, you wouldn't have a handful of 5 or 6 or 7 developers, most of whom are on the verge of shutting down because they have no funding. These are dissidents who are providing this at no financial benefit to themselves in order to help their brethren and their sisters left behind in China. And they cannot stay alive as their funding is cut off. If we were doing 20 or 30 or 40 or $50 million of grant funding for these kinds of groups, we wouldn't have 5, 4 of which are struggling to stay alive. We'd have 25 or 30 or more, and that's what we want.
Well, just a couple points. One, to the broader issue of BBG and the like, we have to understand these entities were the world has changed much since they were created. The one I'm most familiar with, of course, are the Martis, TV and radio. And these were set up in a time when we had limited, with 3 major networks and a handful of local and state, national newspapers. Today, you literally are overwhelmed with news. I mean, there's just so much content. And so one of the things I've begun to argue, this is among our top priorities. I happen to be both on the subcommittee on appropriations that deals with this budget and on the Foreign Relations Committee. So I'm all over this, and it's a big priority on 2 fronts. The first is the question of whether or not we should continue to be primarily content providers and producers versus access providers and producers. And I do think I want us to become more access producers. And now, as far as whether or not we can deal with that language that they fought to get in there, it's very simple. That could just be the splash page that you go, the BBG site could just be the site that comes up when you go on, and you could go from there. But the notion that you've argued, that what we want to be able to do is have multiple technologies, as many as possible, available, so that people all over the world, it's not just China, people all over the world will be able to circumvent government censorship to get accurate news and information and to connect with one another, to have access to social media that allows them to connect with one another is invaluable. I have often said that the Castro regime in Cuba has been able to hold on despite embargoes and the Cold War and everything else. The one thing they cannot survive is an open and free internet, because once Cubans are able to talk to each other, they're able to organize action and collect, and also lowers barriers of entry to free enterprise and the like. And so I'm a big believer in that and in continue to move in that direction, but we are dealing here with entrenched bureaucracies. And I would add one more point in terms of the State Department. I do not believe it is helpful when we have someone as our acting Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, and now the nominee, which I hope will not continue, who I think is unfriendly to these efforts. And not just this effort, but the broader efforts that we're discussing here today. And that's another matter, which is a top priority of ours, and that we are working on as well. So you have my commitment on that to make this thing work.
Thank you.
I thank you both for being here. I appreciate the time you've given us. I think this has been an informative hearing. I think from it we take a number of ideas, particularly the expansion, ensuring that we can get in there and figure out, number one, is 15 million enough? Number two, is the 15 million, why isn't all of it, if it's not being spent on broader access to additional tools that are constantly being reinvented as governments figure out how to block those? And number three, the ability and contingencies to surge up if, for example, what happened in Iran were to happen again. It's a time where we know there'll be high demand by people to find out in the news what's actually going on, and it may be times where we might be able to surge access. I would also say that in some particular parts of the world, and this probably applies a lot less to China, but just since we're talking about that concept is, one of the things, there are places where the internet itself is not existent or denied to people, and I know for a fact that satellite technology is used in remote parts of the world and in other places to provide people content, access to the internet. Why can't that be used to apply access to a free internet, for example, on the island of Cuba, where the government doesn't want them to have access to the internet? And so it's not just, in that case, it's not just what's blocking internet access isn't just a firewall, it is the fact that it literally doesn't exist, and when it does, it's very expensive. So there's a lot to work on in terms of the information flow. And then just in terms of the long arm, one of the functions of this commission is to raise awareness. I still think that what we have discussed here today has been reported, but the vast majority of people are just largely unaware of what is happening. And if we take what happened in Australia, we can begin to see the edges of it occurring here. And it's just we are so used to living in a world where we had all the leverage and all the influence that the notion that it somehow has been turned back on us and isn't just attacking our economic interests, but our basic fundamental principles is just lost on people. And we cannot allow that to continue. And we need to look for creative ways to go about it. Some real good suggestions here, some of which we've already begun to work on, some of which the authorities already exist under Global Magnitsky to go after individuals responsible for these sorts of activities. But then also potentially causes of action against people who lose contracts or are fired because of interference by a foreign government, not just China. And I think companies like Marriott and others would be, I think, very reticent to or be more careful about how they would approach this. As I close, I wanted to read from something here that was in our opening memo, because I thought it was stark in comparison to the apology that Congressman Lantos was able to get years ago. I have it here in the notes. And it goes back to, this is a statement from the chief of Marriott, Arne Sorensen. And this has to do when the Chinese authorities blocked Marriott International's websites and apps for a week in China because they listed Tibet, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan as separate countries in a customer survey. They demanded an apology, and they demanded that they seriously deal with the people responsible. And it was as a result of some of this that we saw some of these actions. But here, Marriott issued a formal apology. Unlike the one issued to the mother of that gentleman who was killed, or was jailed, they issued a formal apology. Here's what the Marriott's chief, Arne Sorensen, said. We, quote, "We don't support anyone who subverts the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China, and we do not intend in any way to encourage or incite any such people or groups. We recognize the severity of the situation and sincerely apologize," end quote. Well, again, I would say to you that there are people living in Taiwan who have a strong difference of opinion with Mr. Sorensen and with the Communist Party about sovereignty and territorial integrity. And by the way, so this is an American company benefiting from the freedoms and the opportunities in this nation, who come up here and lobby for tax cuts and deregulation and everything that benefits them, basically, openly apologizing and firing an American in order to be able to continue to operate in that marketplace. We see this trend repeated over and over and over and over again. And when I read about the CEO of Apple at an internet conference, an internet freedom conference in China, talking about, on the one hand, attacking a rival for selling off data and information, and on the other hand, turning over the entire cloud in China to a government server, the hypocrisy is unbelievable, unbelievable. And yet, somehow they get away with this. They're held up as these heroes. And we need to continue to call that out and shame it for what it is. You cannot be representing yourself here in this country as a defender of freedom and openness, and yet complicit and accomplices of repressive regimes under the guise of we have to follow their laws because their markets require it. It goes to show that the bottom line and the ability to look good in front of shareholders and return profits is more important than the supposed universal values that these companies have no problem touting here at home, where they have the freedom to do so without retribution, and all we can do is talk about it. We're going to continue to do that. We're not going to allow what happened in Australia to happen here. I promise you that. And we're going to help Australia deal with it as well. So I thank you, because what you've provided us here today is invaluable. And I am grateful for the time you've given us, for your insight. We look forward to continuing to work with you. The record for the hearing will remain open for 48 hours. Dr. Sweat, the totality of your statement will be entered into our record without objection, and without the hearing is adjourned.